Okay, so who could have guessed? Modernia of all units is back for a rerun for the new year. This is actually the first time a standard pool pilgrim got a rerun banner. Other than the janky rerun system for the Christmas units, the only other time a standard unit got a banner was Alice for whatever reason. Anyways, I don't think Modernia needs much introduction. She first debuted at this exact time last year and is known to be one of the best DPSs in the game. So while the year isn't over yet, I'm gonna do one last guide in 2023, just before the edgy version of Scarlet arrives. Let's find out how you can build Modernia and how to play her. My name is Psyche, and let's begin. So when Modernia first released, there wasn't a good AOE option when it came to mobbing. The only alternative was Haran. But to be honest, she launched 2 months into the game so that there wasn't a lot of time to work with. Anyways, Modernia proved that unlike Haran, a unit can be busted in both campaign and challenge content. I run her all the time in my teams. She occupies a niche that's still somewhat lacking in the game. In fact, when Mother Whale was one of the raid bosses, people in my union try to get everyone to use their Modernia team to beat it before using any other team, just because she's one of the few units that can hard counter Mother Whale. So what does she do and how does she do it? Let's find out by going over Modernia's kit. She is a minigun user, attacker class, fire code. 300 shots in 1 tank, 2.3 seconds reload. As per usual, I'll be using my leveling priority criteria for talents, so get your resources handy, as this is one Nikke you're gonna want to invest in. Skill 1. When a normal attack hits, she deals additional damage per shot, and when 200 normal attacks land, she stacks a crit damage up buff up to 5 times, while also decreasing max ammo in the process. It's a lot of fancy wording, but it's really just one of those passive effects that you can forget about in the background as it generates you value. This skill gets a high priority, mainly for the attack up. Given that this additional hit of damage happens every time a bullet lands, it's basically a linear damage increase on steroids. Being a minigun user, this one's gonna trigger constantly. You might also be wondering about the ammo decrease, how it might be bad. But to be honest, there isn't much to worry about. First, the magazine decrease is constant throughout the levels, from 1 to 10. So even if you didn't invest in this skill at all, you're still getting the same amount of decrease versus if you max it out. Second, the reload time for Modernia is actually not that bad. Well, not as bad as other minigun DPSs. If you take a look at Guillotine or Lumilla, you can see that they actually have a longer reload time versus Modernia of 2.3 seconds. If we combine this with her burst that we'll talk about a bit later, as well as overload gear, you'll realize that this debuff will hardly matter at all. For the record, this skill is worth leveling or even to the point of maxing out, if you can afford it. Skill 2. When entering full burst, all allies gain a hit rate buff. This doesn't really matter for Modernia herself since miniguns have a reverse recoil mechanic where the gun becomes more accurate the longer you shoot it. Where the skill does matter is in the attack up. When the hit rate buff is in effect, landing 200 hits will give Modernia a beefy attack up for 10 seconds. As long as she's shooting, you can expect this buff to trigger every burst rotation. This one also gets a high priority. Attack ups are especially helpful for miniguns as they tend to fire a lot of shots, so we definitely want a lot of that. The burst. This is where things get interesting. Upon usage, Modernia will first extend the burst duration from 10 to 15 seconds, which can be double-edged whether if it's good or bad. She will also change the weapon to have an large AOE, giving infinite ammo while it's active. This is insanely good for mobbing and campaign stages, and pretty much trivializes any base defending levels. You can technically fit any number of targets within the circle, but this effect comes at a cost. Modernia's overall damage will be lowered per shot. You can kinda see it as like diluting her attack stat in favor of a large AOE circle. You'll obviously get a lot of value if you hit a large amount of enemies, but this can be tricky when it comes to bosses. As there is only one target to be hit, sometimes it's better to not burst at all, but I'll go over this later. The burst gets a low priority, for 2 major reasons. The first is that the scaling for the damage is not that good. Mobbing is already something she does really well, so it's not exactly necessary to level this. The second reason is that while Modernia is good in bosses too, in most cases you actually want to avoid using her burst. Again, for reasons I'll talk about later. Let's move on to gearing. While Modernia works even from the beginning of the game, she gets better with overload gear, and can even offset that magazine size decrease debuff from skill 1. Let's dig out the good old overload lines tier list, and I promise to rework this in the new year. I'm not gonna put anything in the must-have tier. You can absolutely get away with not having a particular stat. In the grade tier, we have attack. Again, miniguns love their attack ups. Getting more of it will only help her do more damage, by far more than any other stat in the game. We also have max ammo capacity. and this is here to offset the max size debuff from skill 1. When we combine this with a certain Harmony Cube, we can easily sustain Modernia to fire the minigun for a really long time before needing to reload. The good tier, which I will rename to Situational in the edgy Scarlet Guide and onwards, we have elemental damage as always. If you want to min-max damage against certain bosses, while Alice is also fire code and can be used in place of Modernia as a fire code DPS, it doesn't hurt to have a spare for raids though. Surprisingly, I'm also gonna put crit rate here. This is because she has crit damage buffs built into her kit, up to just over 70%, assuming skill 1 is maxed out at level 10 and all 5 stacks are active. So being able to land that orange number more frequently can obviously be quite good. One more line that you should aim for is hit rate. I mentioned that hit rate generally doesn't matter for miniguns, but this is a little different when it comes to Modernia. This part is really important, but you should try to aim for one hit rate line. Doesn't matter how big the bonus is, just one line of it is enough. And I'll explain why when we talk about cubes. On the better than nothing tier, we have crit damage. Yeah, I know I said to get crit rate, but any additional crit damage on top of that is really not gonna make that big of a dent in the damage ceiling. There's way better lines to get. On the useless tier, everything else, so charge damage, charge speed, and defense are of no use. If you've seen the X Lumilla guide, then I probably don't need to repeat myself here. When it comes to Harmony Cubes, the ideal one you'll want is a level 7 Bastion Cube. Just like Scarlet, because Modernia has a decreased max size due to her skill 1, having max ammo overload lines on top of refunding 3 out of 10 shots makes her downtime when reloading almost a non-issue. Sure, there will be times when you wish Modernia had a full tank, but mostly if you have an invested Bastion Cube, you'll be surprised just how long she can fire for before needing to reload. If you don't have an invested Bastion, you can also settle for the Wingman Cube, which just gives a 30% magazine increase. This does not multiply with any max ammo overload lines, but is a good budget option if you haven't unlocked overload gear yet. You can of course use the Resilience, but other weapon types tend to benefit more from a reload speed increase since they have a much lower max size. Another interesting choice for a cube is the Assault Cube. You might be scratching your head on why this could be useful, and you're about to learn why. And this also connects to why you should get exactly one hit rate overload line. This is because if you take a look at her skill 2, you can see that the wording reads that she will get an attack up when landing 200 hits in the hit rate status. This is actually a little bit misleading, and I'll blame the localization team on this. You would think that you need the hit rate buff from skill 2 to be active in order to start accumulating 200 hits for the attack up. But it really means if Modernia has any hit rate buff at all, then she will satisfy the hit rate status condition. If you're late into the game and have unlocked overload gear, having one line of hit rate is good enough to trigger this. I tested this in game, and if I just have one line of hit rate, going into the shooting range, you can see that by landing 200 hits right from the beginning, she will get the attack up from skill 2. Alternatively, if you're early into the game, using the Assault Cube will also work. This method allows you to get the attack up without having to wait for the full burst, which is a good way to min-max damage. You can also use another ally that buffs hit rate, but they will ideally have to give the buff at the beginning of battle and have good synergy with Modernia. Sorry Drake and Noor, looks like your buff doesn't quite cut it. Okay, as it turns out, there's actually some nuance when it comes to Modernia's gameplay. You might think she's a fairly brain-dead unit to pilot. Shoot fast, deal damage, but there's a bit more than that. While she's amazing in both campaign and bosses, there is something to be aware of. If you can help it, try not to use Modernia's burst in boss fights. This is because her damage will be diluted in the AOE circle, so if the boss only counts as one target, then the AOE effect is pretty much wasted, and can even unnecessarily extend your burst rotation by 5 seconds. This means in team building, try to fit 3 type 3s in the team, so that you avoid using Modernia's burst during a boss fight. However, I do need to point out that there are times when Modernia's burst can actually be pretty good in bosses, such as times when the boss launches destroyable projectiles. If you can time it right, you can clear those projectiles with ease with the burst AOE. So while the burst doesn't maximize your damage against the boss, it does counter select boss's attacks. In these cases, it is acceptable to only have 2 type 3s in the team, as you will be benefiting from Modernia's burst. Some of said bosses include Chatterbox, Blacksmith, and Altaisan. We finish off with team building, and I've already given you a warm-up in the gameplay section. Just like Scarlet, Modernia is also a unit that just pops off without you having to do any special team configurations with support cores. She's first well known in the team referred to as the God Comp, This team has pretty much everything you need to be sustainable, though I will admit, would have been considered pretty OP back at launch. But now, other comps can match this output, and in some cases do an even better job. That being said, you can also use the bunnies as a support core, whom which I'll finally be able to use Blanc when New Year arrives via the SSR selector, and I'll finally be able to show off the bunnies in action in my future videos. I think everyone knows just how good the bunnies are. They got the entire package: healing, defense, and attack ups. You will still need a CDR unit, but this core is almost unkillable. Tiga is also a good core, but it will also leave you with only 2 slots for the Type 3s, so you would be forced to use Modernia's burst. The gist of building a Modernia team is that you should be careful that unless Modernia can counter a boss's attacks, try to run 3 Type 3 DPSs to prevent using her burst, as that will gimp your damage, only in boss encounters obviously. So all in all, she is super flexible that unlike Scarlet's self-harm mechanic, you can get away with almost any support core provided that all your needs are covered. I have no doubt that a lot of you will be Modernia havers this new year. She's a pilgrim, so while that drop chance is a little more sus than usual, getting at least 1 copy will make your life in all content much easier. She's still unmatched in base defense levels, consistent in damage and bosses, and the only thing to watch out for is not using her burst in these encounters. She's a 5 out of 5 for sure, and the second DPS that I personally built up other than Scarlet when I first unlocked Overload gear, as she only gets better with investments. Modernia's general usability will be able to help you perform everything more efficiently, and for me, one of the first options to bring to challenge content, as I'm sure you've seen in my raid guides. This also wraps up the last video for 2023. I think it's been a pretty productive 4 months for the lifespan of this channel. I hope you enjoyed this year Nikke, because I certainly did. And I'm excited to see what edgy Scarlet has to offer. Enjoy the New Year event, and I'll see you in 2024. Always remember, have fun playing.